Hello, everybody. Welcome to a learning briefing about the child safeguarding practice review for child 20. I'm Karen Perry. I was the lead review and author for this piece of work. And what we're going to cover in this presentation is a bit about the background, but focus primarily on the learning and the recommendations. The presentation is designed so that you can view it if you're on your own as an individual, although you would get a lot about if you view it as part of a small group, because you will see there are some reflection and discussion points within the learning briefing. Sophie will put an introduction on, which is clear when this is publicised how long is a realistic amount of time you need to set aside, but I'm thinking probably a bit over an hour will allow you to listen to what I've got to say, but much more important, have 20 minutes or so discussion about some of the key points I think it will help you to reflect on. So let's start with a brief introduction to the case. It's about a child who was 4 at the time of the incident that precipitated the review. And when I say incident, that actually involved that child managing to leave the house unsupervised. And then he had a serious accident. Fortunately, he survived, and there doesn't appear to be any long-term physical effects, although at the time he did have a fractured skull, and who knows what the emotional trauma may have been. Living in his household at the time were his mother and a primary school age sibling, and periodically a teenage half sibling. And the time scale that the partnership picked for the review was from December 2019, when siblings primary school started to identify increasing concerns about that child, and up until June 2022, when child 20 had the accident. Bit of background, mum has a health condition which causes her to fall asleep unpredictably. It's a long-term condition which can be managed by medication, but the practitioners didn't fully understand the symptoms or the treatment. In March 2018, there had been a child and family assessment which had led to intensive family support involvement, which was ongoing throughout much of the period under review. Half sibling moved so-called permanently to live with his father in December 2019. There were a number of concerns reported throughout the review period by the children's schools, the health visitor and the police about the children, raising concerns about the children's care. There was a particular incident of physical abuse in February 2021 after mother's partner, a recent partner and a short-lived partner, threw a toy at sibling's head. That led to child in need involvement led by a social worker. In fact, the concerns I've referred to previously could, prior to then, or subsequently to the involvement, have led to strategy meetings, possibly other Section 47 inquiries, and even a initial child protection conference, because mother's ill health led to lack of supervision, where the children could have come to serious harm. In August 2021, escalating tension between half sibling and his dad. So half sibling began to move more frequently to live between the households. Sometimes he moved out because one of his parents asked him to, and sometimes he voted with his feet. And the pressure increased on mum autumn time of 2021, when she actually requested respite from the children, but on reflection decided that she didn't like the idea of respite for the care. In December 2021, a child protection strategy meeting was called. The reason for that was a number of concerns felt by the school and the IFS worker. but the chair disagreed that the threshold was met for an initial child protection conference. And then the follow-up strategy meeting didn't happen, not helped by the previous social worker having left and a new one having started. And one of the interesting things we discussed at the practitioners meeting was about the question that manager posed at the strategy meeting, which was, what would be the benefits of a child protection plan given there was already a child in need plan in place? And at the time, the practitioners found it quite hard to answer that question. But on reflection, we concluded that the benefits of a child protection plan, you may be able to think of some more, but there were at least three. One is that you will have actually had an initial child protection conference where all the right practitioners, all the agencies who've been involved will have been there and will have had to construct their thoughts possibly into writing and share information. And that might have included, it would have included the GP and possibly the neurologist. A child protection plan, of course, means that the child's much more visible, in particular if they end up, for example, at A&E. If there were another accident, then A&E would recognise and think about a context of a child protection plan. And also the fact that kids on a child protection plan do tend to be treated with higher priority for ongoing engagement by practitioners working with them. Okay, in 2022, as a result of that increasing concern I described earlier, in the autumn of 2021, adult social care became involved and agreed a support package for mum. That included telecare, which is actually something where a buzzer would sound and wake mother up if anybody had left the house without her knowledge. But unfortunately, that wasn't progressed. One of the barriers was the need for a financial assessment of mother, which she probably would have passed without any difficulty, but that was a big barrier why she didn't want to progress it. And also the children's practitioners working with the family not fully being aware of what was being proposed and what the benefits would be. Early in the summer of 2022, there was increasing conflict between half-siblings' parents about his care and concerned about the youngest children's behaviour. They're very boisterous when they were together, the two younger children, and half-siblings' emotional well-being. And finally, in June 2022 was the incident that precipitated this review. Child 20's accident happened when mum was asleep, as I said earlier. And in fact, what had happened, which wasn't that unusual, was the older child, who was only 7 or 8 at the time, had managed to leave the house. And the younger child, age 4, followed out after them. So before we go on to the learning, it's quite helpful perhaps to think about what the overall conclusions were to give you a context. So he was injured, child 20, when unsupervised during one of the times mum had fallen asleep. And practitioners had made quite a lot of attempts actually to try and help her get medication and create safety plans. However, the effectiveness of their efforts was undermined by it because they just didn't properly understand the medical condition. And that meant they couldn't also effectively distinguish between what deficits in her care were due to her health and which ones due to poor parenting. So, methodology of the child safeguarding practice review. I'm going to whiz through this. I'm sure at some point there will be people listening who actually participated, so of course they'll know all too well. The rest of you perhaps might not have been involved in CSPR before. A critical principle is involving frontline staff and first-line managers, and that should be done on a single agency basis when individual agencies are gathering together information and reports for the review. But it's very important to come together as a group in a meeting to discuss the practice during the case. We work collaboratively and analytically, and in particular that means not so much focusing a huge amount of detail on what happened in terms of practice, but why certain decisions were made, because it's in understanding the why that we can think about whether, if we think there is some learning, what might be effective changes to benefit other children in the future. We're very clear about having a no blame culture, and we use cases to do something called a window on the system. So that means what we're trying to do is distinguish between the things that were unique to this particular case and the things that were systemic, and that might happen again if practitioners were presented with a similar kind of family in a similar circumstances. Those are the ones where you can identify learning, whether it be about good practice to build on that, or whether it be about things perhaps you want to reflect on and change. Really important the child stays centre of all our work. And as I've already referred to, that we identify and promote what worked well and what was good practice. And if you read the full report, and I'll tell you how you can access it at the end, you will see that, that good practice is referred to throughout the report, and particularly at the end. And the other thing that's really important is family involvement. So family know that the review is happening and that they're offered the opportunity to contribute, to provide their reflections on what they think went well in terms of service delivery, and any changes they might recommend that would have helped them. And in this case, we were very fortunate because Mum did agree to be involved, and she will have seen the report before it was published. The children in this case were too young to contribute. So let's start going through the learning points. And the first analysis theme for the report was think family in terms of responding to Mum's health, her care and support needs, and to half siblings. So bear with me, I turned one too many pages, excuse me. Social workers informing GPs and any specialist service involved that children are subject to children and need plans will be beneficial. Obviously, you need a parental consent for this. Though, of course, if parents don't give it, that might give you pause for reflection on whether or not their lack of consent and their wanting to work fully in partnership in that way might increase the risk for the children. If GPs and specialist services, in this case the neurologist, know that social workers are involved, then that will mean that they are much more likely to share information and recognise circumstances where they need to liaise. Also really important that social workers share their assessments with other practitioners. Again, consent is an issue for child in need cases. In this particular case, and in general, it would ensure that previous history is widely known, and it would offer the opportunity to correct any errors. In this particular case, the medical condition the mother had was referred to by completely the wrong condition, which has entirely different symptoms and a different treatment and different implications. And had the assessment been shared either with mother or with other practitioners, that would have been picked up. And finally, the importance of understanding daily routines from a child's perspective and how they impact on that child's lived experience. In recent years, we've all been much more focused on reflecting on children's lived experience in neglect cases. Are they hungry? Are they understimulated? Are they getting enough supervision? The wording about daily routines was thinking about how to identify the impact of mother's health condition on these children. And you might not be thinking of ongoing daily routines. You might be trying to help children think about particular days and give you examples. Again, in the same Think Family theme, safety plans should be produced collaboratively with practitioners as well as parents, be put into writing and shared with practitioners. The intensive family support worker did do work on safety plans with Mum, but they weren't put into writing and they weren't seen or contributed to by the school, for example, whose contribution would have been really valuable, both in terms of what went into the plan, what would have been beneficial for the children, but also in terms of monitoring its success or adherence. Unusual health conditions, practitioners will benefit from having a meeting with specialist health professionals in a setting where they can ask questions. Had there been an initial child protection case conference, then a report from the GP would have been available, possibly one from the neurologist. That neurologist might even have attended. But useful and valuable though that would have been, it's not the place to have a detailed discussion about the impact of the health condition or to ask lots of questions about it. Much better to arrange a separate meeting. And the neurologist did indicate that had they been asked, they would have been willing to participate in such a meeting. You've heard how sibling moved about. And also the fact that he was a teenager, I think, also impacted on the fact that it's harder to keep him in mind. Even if older children and siblings who don't live permanently within the household are not the primary focus of involvement, attention still needs to be paid to their needs and the impact of their behaviour on younger children, and the collective impact on the parents' ability to cope. In this case, the half-sibling, was actually named on the child in need plan, but there's very little evidence of his needs being considered. And often the school to which they attended wasn't invited to participate in key meetings. And this was very relevant at the time that autumn when Mum was finding life particularly difficult. And also because there's evidence that he found the younger children's boisterousness irritating, which meant that he could be quite threatening and frightening. And his coming and going had an impact on them. So we're going to take a slight pause now because we've come to the moment where there's an opportunity for some reflection. And what I'm suggesting you do, either individually or if you are within a group together, think about these, what they are essentially two questions. And so the first one, how would you go about finding out about an unusual health condition, the causes, symptoms and treatment? And what do you think the challenges are in finding out details and being confident that they're accurate details, and how might you overcome them? If you're on your own, try and come up with 3 challenges and solutions. If you're part of a group, I think you can probably aim for 5. And then, having spent maybe 10 minutes on that, come on to the second question, which is about what are your top tips and techniques for finding out about a child's daily routine and lived experience? And again, it doesn't hurt to do that through the lens of first identifying the challenges in doing that, and then identifying how you overcome those challenges. Okay, when you feel you've had enough discussion, we'll move on. Okay. So, next slide is about referrals, assessments, and escalation processes. So, assessments should be updated when there are significant changes in a child or family's circumstances. More helpful to do that than to do it in a particular time frame, like annually or something. More helpful to think about things have changed, circumstances, the household's different, the circumstances are more complex. Now is the moment to reassess. And one of those moments for this particular case might have been when half-sibling moved back in autumn of 2021. Second one, convening of a strategy meeting does not require a specific incident. Accumulation of neglect incidents, or it might be entirely appropriate to convene a strategy meeting. Having said that, if there is a really serious neglect incident, as was the case for when a number of times actually when the children managed to leave the house, it's still appropriate to convene a strategy meeting. And current practice doesn't require impact or other chronologies or anything in writing actually for strategy meetings. and you don't want having to produce something in writing to be a barrier. But if you do have those things, it's likely that they might be really useful to inform the discussion and decision making, especially where the concerns are about neglect. So further learning points. Senior managers from other agencies can request that an initial child protection conference is convened. I don't think anybody in the practitioner group knew that, but it is in your policies and procedures. And although it's always a social care manager who makes the decision about whether or not there is going to be an ICPC, they should take seriously any request, and they should put their reasons in writing, which might lead to fuller reflection if the referring agency still doesn't agree. Learning points, further learning points about referrals, assessments, and escalation processes. There were lots of concerns from other agencies and requests for social work or Section 47 involvement, or even initial child protection conferences, which weren't accepted by children's social care in this case. But in your procedures, it does say that senior managers from other agencies can request that an initial child protection conference is convened, and that this will be given serious consideration and a response given in writing, because it's social care who makes the decision. But there should be a dialogue about it if senior managers from other agencies have serious concerns. Police notifications of a safeguarding concern, of which there were a number in this case, should always have management oversight. This is important because otherwise individual incidents or cumulative ones might not be properly recognised. And it might seem odd to have it in there. Some of you might be thinking, well, don't they always have management oversight? Well, they do if there is a referral into first response on a new case. But if the police notification or referral is about an open case, whether it's early help or social work case, then if it goes in via first response, then the manager will get an email. But as we all know, the sending of an email doesn't necessarily mean that the content is seen and indeed not always seen in a timely way. Okay, and finally on this slide, where single incidents of lack of supervision could have serious constitute, this is still neglect. This can be neglect, even if otherwise the child's care is mostly good enough. And there was a particular incident where a sibling, who was 8 at the time, had been seen on the garage roof by a neighbour, and there were two of those occasions. One of them, mum had asked him to go out there and fetch a ladder or some such. And the police's concern was partly reduced by what they found when they went, because she was cooking a nice meal for them, and they evidently had positive relationships. But that detracted from the fact that this child being out on the roof, aged 8, having been asked to be out on the roof, could be seen as neglect, and there could be serious consequences of that. Okay, requests for escalation from other agencies to the council usually should be included in the child's intensive family support social work record in a way that facilitates management oversight of cumulative and chronic concerns. In other words, so that when you look at a file, it's very easy to see when there are an accumulation of concerns. That's really, really important, as I'm sure you know in your day-to-day practice for neglect cases. Sometimes important to build a picture where there might be suspicions of physical abuse or child sexual abuse, though, too, although neither of those were an issue in this case. Excuse me. When social care feels that the threshold hasn't been met for allocation to a social worker or for the convening of a strategy meeting, the reasons for them thinking that should be put in writing, because that will make sure that there hasn't been a misunderstanding between the referrer and the social care. and it will assist any follow-up challenge by practitioners if they feel their reasoning has been misunderstood. Okay. And in fact, there was an example in this case where a request for the allocation of a social worker was refused, where there was a context of misunderstanding. Okay, let's do another think and pause point. A couple of things for you to think about. Maybe 10 minutes reflection on your own or in a group, thinking about neglect. So what are the challenges in identifying when neglect might amount to significant harm, and how can you overcome them? And when might a single incident of neglect require a strategy meeting, Section 47 child protection investigation, or initial child protection conference? So if you're on your own, try and come up with 3. If you're part of a group, try and come up with 5. Okay, moving on to further learning points about neglect. The review reflected on the recent introduction of impact chronologies and was very positive about their potential in terms of identifying chronic poor care of children. They were less positive about the use then of graded care profile toolkits because they were being used in isolation, and they were not being in isolation in isolation without an up-to-date assessment and chronology, and without necessarily considering all the needs of all the children in the family, including those who don't live there all the time. And that's partly because they're often led by one person who might focus on the child that they have primary responsibility for, not helped by the fact that they aren't usually done as a multi-agency activity, which would be really beneficial. Okay, so that was the end of all of the learning points, and now we're going to move on to recommendations, which hopefully you will recognise the reasons why they became recommendations. So the first one is to consider how best to ensure that practitioners have access to information about parental health conditions during assessments and care planning, and that they seek that information, they recognise when they need to seek it, and they share it with the rest of the practitioner group, especially for those conditions which are unusual and or which might impact on their parenting. This should include consideration about how best to support parents to access necessary treatment and about what would be an appropriate response if they decline to do so. There was some element in this case about mum missing the appointments that practitioners tried to get for her, and not in this case, and I emphasise not in this case, but in a similar case, I have seen examples of where the group rely on the health visitor, who themselves is not a specialist practitioner, and so that can give false assurance in thinking that people do understand a health condition, not that that was a factor in this case. Second review was about checking how things are done in terms of multi-agency audits, checking that improvements have been made in response to this review, and on whether they need to be made even more in terms of safety plans that they are developed and shared with other agencies, that they are put into writing, and that they're effectively monitored, and that when parents or anybody else, agencies, don't comply with them, that is addressed. And the second part that would be a different audit is the response to contact with first response about children who are open, to check that they are getting the same level of services as a similar child or a similar referral would do on a new case, because there was some evidence that perhaps had some of the referrals been made about these children as a new case, they might have got a different response and in particular, linking in the need for making sure there's always management oversight by the accountable team manager, whether in first response or whether of an allocated IFS worker or social worker. Third recommendation was requesting all agencies working with children to review their recording and communication systems to make sure they could see their requests for escalation, and to make sure that internally those are included in the record by IFS or social care, so that management oversight can very quickly see cumulative and or chronic concerns. Agencies told us that sometimes they're so busy that they escalate something and lose track of how many times they've done that. The council should also be asked to ensure that there is oversight of the outcome of strategy meetings on open cases by the case accountable social work team manager if the strategy meeting was chaired by somebody else. That was a complication in this case that I didn't mention earlier. If it had been the accountable team manager, then it might have been more likely that the follow-up actions had been pursued, but it wasn't chaired by the accountable team manager because they weren't available on that day. Okay, fourth recommendation, raising awareness that senior managers from other agencies other than social care can request an ICPC and monitor the effectiveness of such awareness raising and the use of the partnership policy. So you should find, or you should have already found, hopefully, that there have been requests by senior managers for other agencies for ICPC. To request the local authority to ensure that social workers seek consent to share children and family assessments with other practitioners involved with the family, and specifically that they seek consent to notify the GP and specialist medical practitioners for the reasons that I described earlier. For the reasons that I described earlier, that children and family assessments are repeated when the circumstances of individual children or the family changes significantly. And for that one, there will need to be a review of the local guidance, which isn't at all clear about that when an assessment should be repeated. As well as thinking about, well, how are we going to measure the impact of these revised arrangements? To review the work that you've done on the implementation of the introduction of impact chronologies, especially how widely they're being used by agencies and their impact. They were being used a lot by IFS during the period of the review, which is quite some time ago now, but their use hadn't spread amongst practitioners from other agencies, particularly at that point. You were also had also just implemented the neglect strategy, whose findings, actually the audit completed during that, did chime with some of the findings from this CSPR. To make sure when you review the implementation, as good practice dictates you will, that you consider the learning from this review, and in particular think about the use and impact of the graded care profile. And then finally, because learning is a process throughout CSPRs that starts with the rapid review after an incident has been notified to the national panel, and goes through agency gathering information for the process of the CSPR. Really important to check that individual learning points for those individual agencies have been identified, and the partnership to be confident that action's been taken to disseminate the learning and to address whatever necessary action is needed. Okay, applying learning to practice. The partnership is very keen that learning from child safeguarding practice reviews is applied to practice. That is the reason why we're doing it. So, final think point. Perhaps you could identify 3 changes in your future practice because of the learning from this review. What will you do differently because of what you've learned from this review? And the partnership's really keen to understand the impact of CSPR. So if you're willing, So if you're willing, the partnership would be very pleased to hear about it, and you've got an email address there to share them. Again, you can use that email address if you want to read the full report, or you want to find out specifically what action is being taken to address the recommendation. Then you can, if you email them, then you will get a response. I'm told the report is an easy read. What you will get from reading it is much more detail about the whys behind why decisions in this case were made, an action taken or not taken.
Okay.
I leave you on that thought. The last slide is some information about how you can find out more information about what's going on in your local safeguarding area. Okay, thank you. Thank you for listening. I hope you find that useful.